I'm delighted once again to be able to use this form of blended learning to capture a lot of the things that we present in the classroom, but to do this in a rather cutting-edge way that allows us to save some of the stuff that we're doing online, so that students can look at it, particularly at this time of year in preparation for their exams. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the running order, so you know who's doing what. And Joachim is going to be starting us off, and then that's going to be followed up by Louis. And after the gentlemen are finished, then I'm going to come back and cover a little bit of what Professor Costa discussed in class when he was doing the neighborhood policy and aspects also of the Eastern Partnership. And then I'll touch on some EU-Russia aspects with regards to energy security. So here you go. I think that should probably be enough to take us the full hour, hopefully not too much over, but don't forget that we do have the chat box on the bottom left-hand side. So while Joe is talking or while Louis is talking, and also while I'm talking as well, do type them in. And if we can, when we have a break, we can return and type back as well. So that's it for me. Let's go over now to Joachim. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Amelia. Pretty much a nice introduction. What I want to do in the next 15 minutes, really, is just to recap and discuss a little bit what we already did 2 weeks ago, or last week, I think, which is just talking a bit about the way the nature of the EU as an international security actor is changing, might be changing, and some of the institutional changes introduced as a result of the Lisbon Treaty. I mean, there are lots of discussions on it always, and they're normally very general. What I would like to do here is really to zoom in and focus on one specific aspect, and that is the crisis response structures and entire reordering, in a sense, of the External Action Service to focus on this crisis response policy field. So very briefly, I want to kind of at least have 3 points for you to take away from this quick compressed lecture. One is that the EU is really changing as a security actor. It's not only because of the seeming decline of CSDP, where my colleagues Alexander and Louis, I think, also talked about a lot, but it's also because Lisbon brought to the fore a new department and a new institutional setup that focuses more on crisis response, and that includes both non-man-made disasters, i.e. natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, but also responses to man-made disasters, and that's just a euphemism for war or all these aspects of normally crisis management, i.e. CSDP was in charge of. So if we think about Mali, if we think about Libya, Syria, these are all also crises that might in the future be addressed by this new institution in cooperation with the existing CSDP institutions. Briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it takes a bit of a long time. Just quickly, what's happening here is a kind of conceptual battle between crisis management on the one hand, normally a term that was used by CSDP, by the Common Security and Defense Policy, understood as civilian or military crisis management operations, and then crisis response, which so far was normally a term used by the humanitarian community, such as, ECHO, the Commission's service that deals with humanitarian crises, but now is used by the External Action Service as an umbrella term for the entire response spectrum of the EU to a variety of crises. So including CSDP, but also non-CSDP actors. And what does that mean later on in terms of the overall role of the EU as a security actor is something to discuss. And briefly touching on Ashton and her contribution, as you might know, we will see the end of her term next year. She already announced pretty early that she will not serve for a second term. So we might already start now to look at what, if anything, has she actually produced in terms of the EU as a security actor. And, the fancy term here is Ashtonization, and I want to contrast it a little bit with her predecessor, Javier Solana, and his emphasis on CSDP, although I know my colleagues also wouldn't draw the line so distinctively. They would say that Solana also has done some of the things I'll be talking about in a minute. Okay, so very quickly, crisis management, crisis response. Both terms have the word crisis. What is the difference? Why does the difference matter? It matters in a sense because you have different communities, both research and policymaker communities, behind each of the two terms. Crisis management, as I mentioned, was a term that has been particularly used by CSDP and particularly understood also as military crisis management and civilian crisis management. When we talk about that, we normally mean CSDP missions. It's a term that kind of emerged after the end of the Cold War. First, NATO used it to mean actually something that's close to peace operations, peace enforcement. Then the OSCE used it, then the EU used it through the Western European Union, and even the UN adopted it whenever it deals with the EU. When we talk about military crisis management, we normally mean peacekeeping operations or hard-end interventions. And Solana was all about, in a sense, about crisis management. Javier Solana had the key task when assuming his post in 1999 as High Representative of the EU. His key agenda was to get the CSDP structures up and to give the EU a military dimension to really show that the EU has the full spectrum of tools available. Now, depending on how you define crisis, if you whether you have a broad or narrow perspective, that also has implications for your definition of crisis management and crisis response. There is a broad definition which entails all sorts of unforeseen events that might jeopardize the security of a specific region or actor. That can then range from, as I mentioned before, natural disasters to war, conflict, ethnic tensions. That's a very broad term. Or you have a narrow perspective of crisis, which is only those kind of man-made crises that require a military or a mix of civil military response. And bear in mind again that crisis response is something that is more often used now in the EU's external action documents, and crisis response originally was actually a humanitarian term. NGOs would use it, the non-military community would use it. Crisis response is something that you have an immediate catastrophe, you need to respond within hours, if not, in a question of minutes. So crisis response can be to a natural disaster, it can be to an outbreak of a volcano, it can be earthquake, but it can also be to a crisis that erupts in Libya or fighting that might happen in Mali. Now, why is this important? Because what we see right now is a restructuring in the External Action Service to build an overarching mechanism and institutional setup where crisis response gets a new coordinator directly responsible to Ashton, and all the other tools of the EU, humanitarian tools, but also military tools, would be kind of under that authority, and the EU would, through that new department, decide when a crisis breaks out, which of the different tools would be used. So what is that? At the end of the day, it's supposed to be this new move towards a real comprehensive approach. We've been talking about the comprehensive approach for, well, 20 years at least. What is the comprehensive approach? It's essentially the aim of bringing all the different tools that the EU has, economic, military, civilian, under one umbrella and have a truly comprehensive response to any kind of challenges. In a narrow reading, that means that crisis management as just practiced by the CSDP can only be one element of an overarching crisis response. Quickly, just to recap, I mean, normally there's an animation, now it's just a photo. That's, for example, the flow of information between the different departments, different sections of both the European Commission and the External Action Service. You have the European Commission on the left-hand side and the External Action Service on the right. You have, of course, flows of information and coordination with the UN system, the NATO member state actors, and so on. Pretty complicated, pretty difficult. Now, how to manage all this? What you see here is a kind of graph that outlines the phases of a crisis. And the idea is, behind the External Action Service new approach, that for each different phase of a crisis, you would have to need different tools, and different actors of the EU will get involved at a different sequence. I mean, you could, of course, criticize this for being very theoretical, because, a crisis is a crisis because it's most of the time unpredicted or badly predicted. So to what extent you can then follow this scheme is a different story. But the plan behind it is, as you can see, everything until the crisis breaks out, where you have this nice little flash in the graph, is a matter for conflict prevention. And as you know, even though Solana tried to work on conflict prevention, it's only under Ashton that you have, for the very first time, a unit in the EU's External Action Service just dealing with conflict prevention. That's the unit K under Jenny Joel. Well, Jenny and Joel, I don't know what's the first name, what's the surname. Key thing is that this British officer is building up a unit in the External Action Service that's supposed to monitor the entire world in terms of possible crises, set indicators on when a crisis might break out, and then try to put in mediators to prevent a conflict. So pretty important, but the unit is very understaffed right now and is still in the build-up. But it's hoped to be one of the legacies that Ashton leaves before she leaves. Right, after conflict prevention and when the crisis breaks out, you're actually then supposed to move into that mode of crisis response. When the new institutions, the crisis response system and the crisis platform, I'll show you a graph in a minute, it's a bit complicated but to try to understand it, is in charge of then allocating different players in the EU system who should then respond. Normally it's the crisis response unit itself that might send its guru or its head, Agostino Miozzo, who used to be a humanitarian and coordinator of the crisis response unit in Italy. He's in charge, directly responsible for under Ashton, in charge of kind of guiding the entire EU response. He would decide on a certain response, would try to move in either again with mediating or with kind of picking the right tools. And once the crisis is, past its peak, you would then move into the more long-term approach, which is normally CSDP. CSDP is thereby not out of the picture, but it's a tool that will be used once the crisis has already peaked. So something like for stabilization and so on. Why? Because it's the realization that in the past CSDP takes too long to deploy, that member states take too long to decide on the mission, even though they have the capacity to intervene in a matter of days. If you look back on the mission so far, it's mostly a matter of months. So you need something in that gap, crisis outbreak and CSDP implementation, that acts, and the idea is to have the crisis response system to do so. Sorry, this is on the PowerPoint, this is of course an animation. So the point is that this new department of crisis response and operational coordination, called CROC, was set up after the earthquake in Haiti, and after the EU realized it doesn't really have the right tools to respond to a crisis like that outside its own borders. It was in Haiti that Catherine Ashton met this Miozzo guy, who again was there for the Italian Civil Protection Service, and decided, all right, why don't you come to the EU, work for the EAS, and set up a crisis response system based on the Italian system. And the idea was that he would have a coordinating role of all the different actors, that he would set up a crisis platform where all the different actors of the EU come together and coordinate, and he would set up a situation room which kind of processes all information that is relevant for predicting a crisis and responding to it. In other words, this pretty far-ranging plan was to set up an institution that would implement the comprehensive approach to complex crises. Now, whenever you set up a new institution, of course, you will inevitably encroach on the turf of existing organizations. So ECHO, again, which can't be seen here on this graph, sorry, which was established in 1992 by the Commission, is actually the unit that normally deals with humanitarian non-military crises. And then you have CSDP, which is, of course, the institutional setup that deal with military crises and complex civilian military responses. And the idea is that this new department combines the tasks and oversees the tasks of all these actors. So again, it's bringing the Commission together in theory and the Council and CSDP in order to promote this comprehensive approach. Right. Remember again, all I want to say here is that 1998 to 2008 was the Solana decade, and the EU, or the nature of the EU as a security actor, was pretty much focused on getting CSDP off the ground, on building institutions, and having quick impact with many missions. I mean, think about it, we have now 27 CSDP missions, 27, out of which 6 missions were or have been military missions, and the rest are smaller missions, the latest one being the training mission in Mali. That defined more or less what was going on with the EU as a security actor. What you have now, you can call it Ashtonization, is moving away from CSDP, also because member states themselves are not too keen anymore to support CSDP, and to move more to its post-Lisbon comprehensive approach to crisis that I just described. So it's Ashton that came under fire in 2010, both in the UK but also in the Parliament, for not having the right response to Haiti, and it was Ashton who then pushed for setting up an institution that would be able to bring all the tools of the EU together and work from that. So in a sense, it is a small revolution institutionally speaking, because for the very first time, we have always been talking about comprehensive approach, but for the very first time, we now have an institutionalized platform that could bring us closer to this comprehensive approach. And it looks a bit like this. So the CROC, in a sense, is then a response to the realization of the limits of the current EU approach, where we have still lack of coordination and you have the limits of the CSDP. I mean, there was no CSDP mission in Libya, no CSDP mission in Mali. I mean, not even considered in Mali. There was something the French, of course, did more or less on their own. And the gaps of having the system was identified by Ashton. It was delegated to Miozzo. Miozzo has far-ranging powers. I mean, it's one of the words that gets many people going in Brussels. Is his name. He more or less is supposed to be the guy to coordinate everything, and he's also probably the most controversial guy in the EU's institutions. But nevertheless, with all its limitations, you now have the institution that might be able to coordinate the EU's response. And how is that working out? You have three pillars in that new institution. The one is EU information gathering from the member states' consulates. That's still a bit difficult, but the aim is that all the information of the 27 member states come together in this department. Secondly, you have a crisis platform. That's the new innovation, which means chaired by the Secretary General of the EAS or Ashton, that all the players and all managing directors from all the different departments of the EU come together when a crisis emerges on short notice, sit together around a big table and decide how to respond to this. And finally, you have a situation room, which is this intelligence gathering center where all information are brought together and shared. This is how it looks like. That is the crisis platform. It has already been activated 14 times in 2011 during the Libya crisis, when it became clear that there would be no CSDP mission, but that some other response was needed. The crisis platform is a bit of a weird name, because what it is, it's a meeting that brings together around this table the High Representative, the Executive Secretary General, the Directorate Secretary Generals, and Managing Directors, including Miozzo, but also the geographic desks of the External Action Service, Security Director, the INSEN, CPCC, that's the Institution for Civilian Crisis Management, CMPD, which is the Institution for Integrated Planning, and the military staff, but also the Commission departments. That, again, I have to stress this. I mean, it looks like, you look at it and you think, okay, so what? Well, this is the very first time in the history of the EU that you have an institution like this, or a meeting where you can bring all these players together. All these players were normally never at the same time in the same room discussing the same crisis. They would always have their different separate analyses and their different responses. So that is, in that sense, if we want to be modest, it is a modest but actually quite far-reaching institutional innovation. This is how a situation room looks like. The idea is that you would be in constant contact with the national crisis centers of the member states, constantly feeding information, but bringing information together, also feeding on the EU's delegations, 140 around the world. I mean, tricky, because many delegations almost act like mini organizations. They're very jealous about sharing information, sometimes rightfully, sometimes not. The idea is also to use the situation room to work with regional organizations, and in fact, the EU has already replicated situation room model in different regional organizations. So it has worked with the Arab League to establish an Arab League situation room, and it's now negotiating with ASEAN, the regional organization of Asian states, Southeast Asian states, to implement a crisis room also in that organization. And the hope is that you then build a network of situation rooms modeled on the EU that can then cooperate on a global level. Pretty ambitious. Let's see where this goes to. Then just briefly, final two slides, just to see it's not just about institution building, it's not just about blah, blah. It was used already in Libya, but because we focus so much on what wasn't there, we focus so much on the absence of a CSDP mission that often we forget what actually happened by the other institution. And it was the first time the Crisis Response and Operational Coordination Department was working. It was early on the ground. It was actually the institution that then established an EU delegation in Libya. We have to bear in mind that it's the first time ever an EU delegation is operating in Libya. There was none before. And if you don't have a delegation as an organization in the country, you have no ears and you have no eyes about the conflict. So it was very difficult to get information other than from member states. They were not that keen to share information. So we also, again, as the managing director of the Crisis Response Unit, moved in, found a relevant spot, liaised with local politicians in the crisis situation still, and established very quickly an EU delegation that is still there, up and running right now. It was about early action, quick action. It was about visibility for the EU, but of course there are still remaining problems. Just by opening a delegation, you still don't, of course, solve all the problems of all the crises. But at least you can now try to coordinate, especially the recent move by the EU to set up a CSDP mission, which is the border control and border assistance mission that has been set up recently by the EU. Right, so to conclude this all, kind of 5 points I want to leave you with, both from an academic perspective, but also policy-oriented. On the one hand, it's quite important to focus on individuals. I mean, we keep on forgetting often, or we don't do it enough. We focus on member state, of course, most important actors. We focus on international level, but we also have to every now and then, again, open in detailed fashion the black box that is the EU bureaucracy and focus on different key individuals that push the EU by using opportunities into one side or the other. Solana, very big influence on CSDP. Ashton, more timid, less interested in CSDP, but more interested in building this comprehensive approach that we've seen here. So finally, we have institutional innovations that are quite far-reaching, which I talked to you about, the setting up of the CROC. Still not that very well known, but actually deeply important, because if it works out, all the other institutions are supposed to be coordinated by this. To what extent there are deep changes, and to what extent it might just be short-term change because it's personal dependent, is a story or question we have to follow, especially when Ashton leaves next year. To what extent will those institutions survive? You could, for example, speculate that if Solana was still in place right now as the High Representative, it's questionable whether CSDP would be as much marginalized now as it is right now if he still had been in charge. Probably not. He would have made, individually speaking, a big difference in keeping CSDP alive. And finally, then, we need to do a bit more of research on crisis management versus crisis response. What does it mean conceptually? What does it mean for the policy implications? And if anyone is interested in this, following this up as a thesis or something, there is still a huge gap, believe it or not, in research on CSDP, on conflict prevention and humanitarian response. For example, work on ECHO is really, really, really thin, and whereas research on CSDP is pretty well established, and on conflict prevention is also pretty thin. What you still don't have is an integrated research agenda that combines CSDP, conflict prevention focus, and the humanitarian response. So in a sense, it would be time for a comprehensive research approach, if you want, bridging the gaps between those. Right, and that's pretty much it from my side. I thank you for your attention and hand over to the famous and infamous Louis.
All right, so good afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed Joe's presentation as much as I did. I think he's onto something really when he's talking about the shift from from crisis management to crisis response. So that's definitely a theme worth exploring, and he's doing that. So anyway, what I want to talk to you about in the next few minutes, I wanted to summarize sort of the main points that I made during my lecture on EU-US relations back in March. But as I did in the lecture, instead of giving you a sort of descriptive presentation about the institutional relationship between the European Union and the United States and its different aspects, what I'm going to do is talk to you about how the U.S. factor has affected the process of European integration and the evolution of geopolitics in Europe more broadly. So, in other words, what I'm going to do is use the US-EU theme as an excuse to look at European integration from a broad geopolitical perspective. My central message is going to be that the United States has been the decisive factor in European geopolitics since World War II, and that strategic decisions made in Washington have framed the environment within which the European integration process emerged and developed, both during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. And as a result, and this will be sort of my concluding statement, I think the current geostrategic reorientation that the U.S. is undergoing towards the Asia-Pacific region, away from Europe, I would say is having deep transformative effects upon the geopolitics of Europe and its broader neighborhood that will very much affect and are already affecting the nature of the European integration process, although they're doing so in rather subtle and indirect ways, I would say. Okay, so let me then get started. As I was saying in the lecture, and as it really couldn't be otherwise, given its pivotal position in post-war European geopolitics, the United States played a critical role in the birth of the European integration process. As the Cold War was emerging in the late 1940s, the United States and also Britain, I would say, believed that the unification of West Germany, which, as you all know, was by then split into three sectors: the French, the American, and the British sectors. So it wasn't only Germany that was divided; it was also West Germany that was divided. And the United States believed that the unification, that the consolidation of these three sectors in West Germany, the reindustrialization of West Germany, and the remilitarization of a united West Germany were crucial if the Western effort to contain Soviet power in Central Europe was to be successful. However, and for a number of reasons, France opposed to such designs, but it could not resist the process. So the United States, and to a lesser extent, I would say the United Kingdom, imposed the reunification, reindustrialization, and remilitarization of West Germany upon France. And it was in this context, in an environment where France's choices were constrained by the strategic decisions made in Washington and in London, that the 1949 Schuman Plan, which, as you all know, originated the European integration process, came about. This Schuman Plan was an effective solution for France to sort of mitigate concerns about excessive German power, and that's what the Schuman Plan was mostly about. Because under the European Coal and Steel Community, which was one of the outcomes of the Schuman Plan, West Germany would actually surrender the control over the industries of the Ruhr Valley that had allowed Germany to outperform and overrun France in the past strategically. So the Schuman Plan was a French reaction to the decision made in Washington and London to prop up West Germany industrially and eventually politically. It's important to look at the other side of the story, because if European integration was the first caveat to West Germany's industrialization, then integration within NATO's military structure was an additional caveat, in this case, to West Germany's remilitarization. Because throughout the entire Cold War period, West Germany would lack an independent military command and control infrastructure. So the German armed forces were completely under U.S. command via NATO. So we find a situation during the Cold War in which both West Germany's industry and West Germany's military are, in a way, subordinated to Washington and Paris, respectively, via two different international institutions, the NATO and the European Community. So I think it's important to look at European integration in the broader framework of to look at European integration as one additional element within a broader geostrategic design made in Washington and in London. I would say that both NATO and the European Community were two different instruments that were at the service of the same geopolitical objectives: to keep the Germans down, to keep West Germany down, and secondly, and progressively more and more important, to keep the Russians out of Europe, meaning or Western Europe, Central Europe. So I think both NATO and the EC were very complementary during the Cold War. I mean, there were two different parts of the same system, because the United States was very, was very aware of the fact that the security of Western Europe against the Soviet Union depended not only upon territorial defense, which was the business of NATO, but also upon the political stability and economic development of Western European countries. So the assumption of interdependence among the military, political, and socio-economic aspects of security was a central component of U.S. post-war European strategy. Now, I won't get into additional details on the Cold War and the motivations behind U.S. Policy towards Europe during the Cold War. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. I'm just going to move on to the post-Cold War period. Now, as I'm sure you all know by now, the collapse of the Soviet Union led many international relations experts and scholars and pundits to assume that the U.S., following the collapse of Soviet Russia, would shift its political attention away from Europe elsewhere. And this was, to some extent, true. I mean, there were very significant troop reductions of U.S. troops on European soil during the 1990s. For instance, in 1990, there were 290,000 U.S. military personnel in Europe, and in 2010, like three years ago, there were only 80,000. However, I would say, and in spite of these very substantial military reductions, the post-Cold War period, and in particularly the 1990s, because after September 11th, there's a different story. I will get into it very soon. But the post-Cold War period, meaning the 1990s, was characterized by important geostrategic continuities that kept the United States very much tied to developments on the European continent. During the 1990s, the driving paradigm organizing U.S. foreign and security policy was the post-Cold War, how to manage the collapse of the Cold War order, and Europe, of course, occupied a central position in that play. So, as I was saying, throughout the 1990s, the U.S., and primarily through NATO, but also bilaterally, continued to play a pivotal position in the European international system. I think this is very clearly illustrated by the leading role that Washington played in the most significant geopolitical developments in post-Cold War Europe, including, critically, the process of German reunification, which was largely imposed by the United States against British, French, and Russian opposition. The enlargement of NATO, and by association the EU, because we all need to bear in mind that the debate on enlargement was first addressed in a NATO setting, and it was pushed by the United States. So and finally, and although the U.S. was initially reluctant, the stabilization, the pacification and stabilization of the Western Balkans. These are three developments that were central to the reconfiguration of the European geopolitical map in the post-Cold War period, and that would largely determine the existence and the direction of the European Union throughout the 1990s and the first decade of this century. Because, as you know, the negotiations on economic and monetary union were a reaction to the prospect of German reunification, which had been imposed, as I was saying, by the United States. And likewise, I'd say, well, the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe occupied a great deal of the political energies of the European Union in the second half of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And similarly, I would say the stabilization of the Western Balkans, which was an operation executed primarily by Washington, took up most of the bandwidth of the European, of the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy. So my point is that the political agenda of the European Union throughout the 1990s and the 2000s was very much oriented towards dealing with problems and initiatives that had been pushed initially by the United States. So, if you want, in an indirect way, the U.S. During the post-Cold War period continued to play a key role in not only in the geopolitics of Europe, but in setting indirectly the political agenda of the European Union. Now, as I was saying, September the 11th began to change all this, because from the early 2000s, I would say, the driving paradigm in U.S. foreign policy shifted from the post-Cold War period, or managing the post-Cold War, or managing the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the war on terror. If in the former paradigm, the post-Cold War paradigm, Europe was in a pivotal place. In the next paradigm, the war on terror, Europe was in a much more peripheral place in U.S. geostrategy. So from the early 2000s, I would say the U.S. started to pull its military, political, and strategic attention towards the east. First to Afghanistan and Iraq, precisely at a time when Europe's post-war bargain, when the EU and NATO, which were the central institutions through which the Western system in Europe operated, were expanding onto Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe, and even through different initiatives, although not necessarily membership, the Southern Mediterranean and the Levant/Middle East. So, and this is very ironic in a way, because at the very same time when the system that was underpinned by U.S. power was expanding geographically in Europe, meaning eastwards, the very factor, the very engine of that system was being pulled away from the other side, away from Europe. And this created a paradox, I would say, in the geopolitics of Europe. Particularly, I would highlight the fact that the combination of a more stable Central and Eastern Europe and the weakening of America's presence in the European continent multiplied substantially Germany's political possibilities and strategic freedom of maneuver. And this actually represented a qualitative change in the mechanics of European integration, in the mechanics of the European Union, which up until that moment had been sustained by a Franco-German axis where German strategic dependence on the United States, caused by Germany's vulnerability in the East, translated into French political leadership of the European Union. Okay? So I would say this was one of the main consequences. This was one of the main sort of tectonic changes in European geopolitics during the early 2000s, if you want to put it that way. But additionally, I would say, I think that Germany's geostrategic shift away from Europe not only multiplied Germany's freedom of political maneuver, but it also gave Russia and Turkey breathing space in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, because they were not feeling the push of the United States anymore, because the U.S. was preoccupied with events elsewhere. So that gave the main powers to the east of Europe, in this case Russia and Turkey, additional breathing space, and they started to recover and make some gains from the mid 2000s, I would say. And in addition to all this, which to these changes that played out during the early 2000s and mid 2000s, I would say that more recently, in the last few years, and this decade already, the financial, political, and military fatigue experienced by the United States and the strategic rise of China and Asia are further compounding America's geostrategic shift away from Europe. In this case, not towards Europe's neighborhood, as it was the case in the early 2000s, meaning the Middle East, but further away towards the Asia-Pacific region. So, and this very fact is further compounding the puzzle that I just described before, meaning the fact that the balance of power in Europe and in the broader European neighborhood, which for quite a few decades have been defined by U.S. military hegemony, are now opening up. And so we are right now confronting an increasingly contested, I would say, an increasingly contested balance of power both in and around Europe. So now the key question, of course, is how is the vacuum left by America's geostrategic shift away from the broader European neighborhood being filled? And of course, I know that well, a lot of people, particularly in Brussels, would say that the logical conclusion is for the EU to take over that space, but I'm afraid that's not what's happening right now in Europe, and I'm not very optimistic about that. So I wanted to end on with a couple of thoughts on this question, and tell you about what I think are the main geostrategic forces or dynamics that are filling most of the space, most of the vacuum left by America's geostrategic reorientation away from Europe and its neighborhood. These four forces or dynamics are the British-French strategic alliance, military alliance, which is illustrated by the 2010 military agreements signed by Britain and France in November of 2010 in London, the Lancaster House agreements. But it's also illustrated by the cooperation of those countries in foreign policy in general. The best example is perhaps the Libya crisis, but Britain and France are also seeing pretty much eye to eye on Syria and on Iran, and they're working together diplomatically and in terms of intelligence cooperation and military and pre-positioning of military assets and so on and so forth. They're working very closely in a way that no other European countries are, and they're much more engaged. So this would be one of the main forces that I see, the emerging British-French strategic alliance. A second one would be a German-French-led project of European economic and political integration. A third trend would be Russia's resurgence across Europe's east, meaning the northeastern Europe, but also southeastern Europe, the Black Sea basin and the Balkan Peninsula. And finally, I would highlight Turkey's increasing presence in southeastern Europe, in the Caucasus, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and northern Africa. These four dynamics, these four forces, of course, manifest themselves differently in the sense that they lean on very different instruments and have different geographical areas of priority. For instance, Germany's directions are primarily in continental Europe, whereas the British and the French have more of an extra regional ambition. The French more concentrated in the broader European neighborhood in the southern maritime periphery of Europe, between the Gulf of Guinea and Somalia and the Western Indian Ocean. The British perhaps a slightly more global approach. The Russians concentrate primarily in Eastern Europe, and the Turkish in Southeastern Europe / Caucasus / Central Asia. So the four dynamics are very different. They have different geographical areas of priority, and they use different instruments to advance their influence and their geopolitical objectives. And of course, the four dynamics are, of course, not always clear cut and often overlap with each other. There are many question marks hanging over the future of the British-French strategic alliance, because although we see signs of convergence, there are many political and strategic obstacles to a full convergence between France and the United Kingdom, and the same goes to the Franco-German axis, which is now experiencing a moment of crisis, which many analysts are saying has never experienced before. So as I was saying, the dynamics are not always clear cut, and they're often overlapping with each other, because we are, after all, in a period of change where pretty much everything in Europe is in flux. So yeah, I think we don't have much more time, so I'm gonna leave it at that, and unfortunately I don't have time to get into the specifics of each one of these geostrategic dynamics. That's something I already did during the lecture, but I'd be glad to go over it again during the Q&A if you're interested. So I'll just leave it at that and give the floor to Amelia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luis. I think this is a very nice segue, although perhaps a slightly distressing segue into the power vacuum that's begun to open up in post-pivot Europe, if I can call it this way. I certainly have my doubts as to how likely some of these are going to be. I hope that I would pin my hopes on a British-French entente, certainly, but I think there's an awful lot of bandwidth, as you mentioned, that has yet to be taken up in that respect. One area I think that we could see the European Union beginning slowly to fill the power vacuum, or perhaps maybe a little bit more accurately, the geopolitical fault lines that arose as a result of enlargement, is I think the neighborhood policy, and certainly the idea of that was a gentle integrative spread, east-west and also north-south, and some of that has come to pass. I think as Professor Costa showed us in terms of talking about the Eastern Partnership, and I just want to mention this a little bit before I jump into my own slides. I think what Professor Costa was showing us, that of the two geopolitical arcs that make up the neighborhood policy, certainly the Eastern Corridor has far more chance, I think, of converting to an area of geopolitical stability. The South is in such a state of flux and is traditionally a more volatile neighborhood. So I think some of the methods, and certainly what Joe was talking about, crisis management, is going to be that's a very different kind of approach, isn't it, in many, many ways. Now, those of you who've just seen the slides come up, I think will be falling back in horror, because you can see that there's 1 of 36. I have no intention of spending any time at all on every single one of them. This is a very comprehensive lecture with regards to EU-Russia energy security, and I simply want to walk you through a couple of the highlights, I think, to let you know what the salient points are, what the challenges, what the dilemmas are, how each regards each other as a sparring partner. And I think I'd like to do this in loose geopolitical terms, but I think the case study is, as you probably can guess, of course, is energy security, because it has been what has pulled the two sides together interdependently, but also very much what keeps them at each other's throats geopolitically as well. So I'll let you, in your own time, have a look at a variety of these slides and get familiar with them. And if you have had a chance to do some of the reading, I think that's going to be helpful as well. So I'll go through them and just touch on a few of the points as I see fit, and you can type in questions in the chat if you like. Do bear in mind, of course, with energy security, we are talking about a real multiplicity of actors. If it were only just the one or two, it would be so much easier to focus on and to understand and frankly to remember. But of course, it's a distributional issue, if I can put it this way, not only competence-based but institutional-based. So you have a variety of not just public and private actors, but public actors who themselves have a hard time understanding which aspect of energy security they should oversee. Chiefly, I think the spat is generally between the European Commission, with increasing amounts of competence to make policy touching on energy security, but also the member states, who continue to retain the sovereign imperative, the sovereign competence. In areas that really the most important area, and that's the ability to negotiate their energy mix, their energy supplier, their energy routes with foreign suppliers as well. Do bear in mind, of course, that in terms of the European Union's own energy status, you're talking about a very considerable block here, and it's going to only get larger with other states joining. I think the main point here, of course, is that while it gets larger and its demands continue to increase, its indigenous sources remain limited at this point, at least in traditional fossil fuel terms. So we have to get our head around, I think, an old paradigm, the fossil fuel paradigm, but hopefully and very beneficially, I think, a new greener paradigm that the European Union, I think, is beginning to roll out as well. So you have to, I think, also ask yourself whether you can say, credibly, whether the European Union is an autonomous energy actor if it's crippled with a lack of indigenous sources, but at the same time it has a tremendous potential with regards to unrolling renewable technology and the first in the world to legislate on something like the 2020 package. So it does, I think, constitute energy actorness, if I can use this word, and you know it's a favorite of mine, based on competition, security of supply, and sustainability. So these three pillars, I think, are clear features of its increasingly emergent, but not always clear energy policy, if I can put it this way. It also has its own legal framework, the acquis, connected to competition policy, and of course the internal market, the internal energy market. And that, in a sense, conditions very much the ability of the member states to use what is chiefly their competence. So they are very much affected by how they can regulate and sell and protect and use their energy supplies. At the same time, I do feel that all of this enterprise, and has been for many years, still in a sense is rather attenuated by the fact that the member states, again, they still retain the sovereign power to determine the source of their imports. So there's a fairly deep division, I think, in terms of power over that. It would be good, I think, particularly for the exam, to have a clear understanding of energy security as a definition. And I put up what I still think is, in fact, one of the best definitions by Callie, Key, and Goldwyn. This comes from the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2005. The assurance of the ability to access the energy resources required for the continued development of national power, but of course you can broaden this out, and adequate infrastructure to deliver those supplies to the market. But immediately you can see that there is a split personality disorder at the very heart of energy security, not just the European Union, in that given, depending on the kind of state you are, whether you're an importer state or an exporter state, you are respectively chiefly interested with security of supply or security of demand. So you want delivery of sources to you, or you want a reliable and developed market for sale of your products as well. So that's the setup of the energy policy according to the three legs. Do have a quick look at it: competitiveness, sustainability, and security of supply. I think what I'm most interested in at this point, of course, is the third point, because that bears most strongly on foreign policy and the geostrategic need of the European Union to more formally link its foreign policy with security of supply. And it is not as simple as, sticking in a provision into an action plan somewhere. And this still gives me grief anytime you read an EU policy document simply because they've added it in. Doesn't mean in any sense it's done in a deep and analytically and purposive way. And I fear a little bit, simply because it sits under the aegis of something called a comprehensive approach, doesn't necessarily mean that there has been a fulsome and clear understanding of how security of supply functions as foreign policy and vice versa. A couple of slides here with regards to the EU internal energy market, as you know, resting implicitly as it does on open competition. So there's a very strong emphasis by the Commission to enforce single energy market laws, and that has been really difficult. EU legislation and energy in a series of directives have been either poorly implemented or repeatedly flouted. And I think in the third energy package, what we are seeing is a gathering together of a variety of energy directives, all of them, in fact, the bundling, designed to finally lock the market into place, to stimulate competition and eradicate monopolistic suppliers. But the way in which to do this, of course, is to flatten out what is a very bumpy monopolistic playing field in Europe at this point. And the method by which to do this, of course, is unbundling, picking apart the remnants, or in fact the remaining dominant actors, which we would refer to as vertically integrated companies, uncoupling their upstream and their downstream attributes within the European Union to make sure that aspects of competition are much more easily accessible, and third-party access guaranteed as well. This does mean that the European Union, and this is very much from the perspective of Russia, somehow has to play good cop and bad cop in terms of writing and policing its own legislation on this. This puts the Commission, in terms of being a good cop, in the role of a regulatory watchdog, which it tends to do quite well, phasing out regulated prices where it finds them, analyzing proper and improper use of subsidies by various states. And of course, using the whole philosophy of the open market to defend and protect vulnerable customers consistently. But at the same time, the Commission, I think, can go much more robustly down this same avenue and pursue infringement procedures against states who have failed to adopt, who have failed to transpose the Third Energy Package directives, or haven't done it correctly. And of course, this means hauling them up to the ECJ and moving from an area of infringement procedures to deeply politicized understandings of energy and law as well. So the enforcing of the third package is difficult enough, even within the European Union, quite apart from the rather cold reception it naturally had with Russia. It caused outright anger, in fact, among European dominant gas suppliers and Gazprom of Russia. And the statement by Energy Commissioner Günther Oettinger certainly didn't mince words in any sense, as he said Russia must abide by the EU's internal market rules and stop offering widely varying prices, of course, through its own neighborhood customers. This was quite swiftly followed by an investigation into a variety of suspected anti-competitive market practices by Gazprom, whilst obviously investigating precisely the same practices within the European Union's own house, and having a look at which current contracts may exist. And this, of course, did not go down very, very well. Again, of the 3 points, security of supply connects most clearly with foreign policy. So what this slide does is simply list areas in which we would find a strong presence in terms of energy security and energy dialogue. And this is the first point, the EU-Russia energy dialogue. In many ways, I think it's still it's a talking shop. It comes and goes. It doesn't have a huge bearing on the relations between the two sides. It's mentioned at summit time, but it hasn't generated, to my view, any incredibly substantial policy developments. More interesting, I think, although I tend to speak slightly deprecatingly about it, is the potential of the neighborhood policy, and here also the Eastern Partnership, to generate a series of energy partnerships in terms of security of supply and security of demand across the ever-widening European neighborhood, because of course it touches on virtually every state in the neighborhood, being a supplier or a transit country of one of the two, and the same, of course, for the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which preceded the ENP. The separate community treaty, the Energy Community Treaty, not to be confused with the Energy Charter, is a new body of law focused on the energy dynamics emerging from the internal market, and now as a self-standing treaty. Includes the Ukraine as an observer, and also, of course, having emerged out of the Balkans in an unlikely way, I think, in this war-torn region, to find that it's been something of a pioneer in one of the most difficult policy areas still leaves me scratching my head, but it's a very positive development. Also, you'd find energy in EU-Africa strategic partnerships, the partnership, I should say. And although they're not well known, and I think are still a little thin on the ground, the Central Asian strategic plan, so as with Kazakhstan, for example. The future of energy in terms of EU foreign policy, of course, I think it's going to emerge largely from whatever results we see from the Nabucco gas pipeline, and as you'll see in a minute, this has had a fairly horrible history of successes and failures, back and forth. So until there's a concrete output resting on a concrete infrastructure, and that itself becomes worked into the internal energy market in the European Union, and that itself starts to have an impact on the energy profile of the entire Union, it's still incredibly piecemeal at this point. There's no strong blueprint where you see Nabucco operating as the kind of non-Russian, I'll be careful not to say anti, but the non-Russian sourced gas to Europe at this point. Certainly looking at better talking points, stronger dialogue with OPEC and the Gulf Cooperation Council and the IEA and the G8, I think, would allow the European Union, I think, to speak, not only to speak with one voice on energy security, which it has a very difficult time doing, but I think just to raise the profile of it as a topical issue. There are a variety, quite a large number, actually, more and more every year, of types of interconnectors, north and south, east and west. So again, you're seeing the constructing of European pipelines and interconnectors, sometimes almost faster than the legislation can keep up, or at least the policy can keep up. It also features in the EU-US strategic partnership, and more interestingly, in an area where the European Union is struggling, I think, to gain a toehold in the Arctic, seeing itself as something of a policy steward of the North. And this, of course, has caused merriment, perhaps, amongst other Arctic actors, not least of all Canada. The Commission's new role, I think, began in some sense, I think, moving forward from the Lisbon Treaty, but also the crucial partnership or package released on the 7th of September, the EU energy policy, I should say, engaging with partners beyond our borders. And it shows the Commission, I think, emerging as something of a robust energy actor, much more sharply than before. The idea that if they would be mandated by the Council, the Commission could indeed be a negotiator in its own right, not just on trade, which it's always had the mandate for, but now on energy, key energy agreements at the EU level, provided that, presumably on the basis of subsidiarity, they can achieve EU energy objectives with significant suppliers like Russia, like Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan, as well as, and this is the third point from the top, reviewing the variety of energy agreements entered into quite separately by the member states with third countries. The idea that the Commission would sort of put itself, again, as a watchdog by providing an opinion reviewing all of the variety of contracts for goodness of fit, if you like, conformity of these agreements with EU law and EU security of supply objectives. Now, I've got a slide up here which always makes me laugh, because when you think of the sheer paperwork that this must entail for the European Commission itself, such a harbinger of bureaucracy. The point or the response from the Commission was the following: it doesn't mean that the Commission is going to be at the negotiating table in all negotiations. And here I would raise an eyebrow, because that's precisely where it would put the Commission, and it loves being there and it knows it. Or review all existing agreements. And this is the ultimate quote, that would be overly bureaucratic, this from the Commission. It will offer advice, legal opinions on a case-by-case basis. So perhaps there will be some cherry picking with regards to the larger contracts, undertaken by the larger states in scenarios that could affect security of supply. So again, getting to the geostrategic points that Lewis was raising, what are the crucial agreements between European Union and Russia, between member states and Russia, which are the ones which present scenarios which, if they're signed, could affect security of supply. Nord Stream pipeline, for example, would that, in the past, would that have come under this kind of level of scrutiny, and if so, why? Do you think that this is a strong step forward for the Commission? I think in terms of exam responses, but also thinking a little bit more laterally. Do we see the Commission moving into a bold new area of regulatory oversight, or is it just absolutely asking for trouble? Does it concretize the role of energy security at last, despite its rather its oblique status in some senses? Does it finally hand the reins to the European Commission? Does it provide it with a new capacity finally to deal with its own energy security problems? Or does it actually undermine the member states' ability to continue to use and maintain this area of competence? There are, I think, before we get into the toughness between the two, some very decent economic ties between EU and Russia. It's important, I think, to bear this in mind, of course, that the EU is the third most important Russian trading partner in goods after the US and China, with 87 billion euro, which is that's a quite a chunk of change in exports to Russia. So the EU is by far the largest market for Russian goods, and it's not going to go away quickly, that's for sure. But Russia is only fourth for the European Union in terms of imports. So there's a little bit of an asymmetry there to some extent. Certainly, the economic crisis has wreaked havoc on imports and exports as well. And Russia's total account surplus, I think, shot up to rose by 47% as I have here compared to 2009. So they haven't worn it particularly well. They haven't found it a particularly easy tide to manage. I have here what I think is a rather idealistic view from the Commission of how good relations should be between the European Union and Russia. And if you read this carefully, read this the way that we did it in the first term, where we took apart the European Neighbourhood Policy founding declaration. Let's deconstruct this. Every single word counts here, and they have been spectacularly badly chosen, as you can see. The overall objective of the energy partnership is to enhance the energy security of the European continent. Even look at the tense that it's written in, by binding Russia, who wrote this, and the European Union into a closer relationship in which all issues of mutual concern in the energy sector, all issues, can be addressed, while at the same time ensuring that the policies of opening and integrating energy markets are pursued with the strong mutual dependency, not interdependency, but mutual dependency, so a new term, and common interest in the energy sector. This is clearly a key area of EU-Russia relations. You get the point, don't you? You understand what the need is. Clearly the two sides are asymmetric, but they're also interdependent at the same time. I mean, there's trade, there's goods, there's commodity, there's energy. But the idea of trying to tie the two together, nail it together in these words that seem strong and yet are very oblique, I don't think is helpful in any sense. And here is the response from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, not just to this statement, but in fact to the idea that the European Union is going to forcibly pull monopolies apart under the aegis of unbundling, including Gazprom. If the EU continues to push, continues to threaten Gazprom with unbundling directives, continues to insult the sovereign interests of Russia, this is really sharp language, insists on backward economic structures and unenforceable legal attitudes, or undermines bilateral trade relations with European partner states, Gazprom can easily find ways to ensure that energy diversification takes on a swift and permanent Eastern dimension. That, I think, is really putting it clearly, certainly, in typical Russian style. Gazprom can find ways to ensure that energy diversification here is the foreign policy tool, the foreign policy threat, if you like. So while the European Union is encouraged, of course, to continue to diversify, it's something of an energy security dilemma. So you diversify away from your supplier, and they threaten to diversify away from you. A variety of slides here that I think you might find interesting with regards to the exports from Russia. 60%, of course, going to the European Union, 35% of gas from Russia, 34% of oil as well, crude oil. And the result is the following. Again, a kind of sparring, a sharp sparring between the European Union as the security of supply actor par excellence and Russia typifying security of demand requirements. So all I've done is simply line up, bit by bit what is going on either side and how you get intransigence and political stasis at best and gas spats at worst. Now, there have not been too many, but they have certainly had a material impact and also a very substantive impact in terms of policy as well. And the outcome is the following: very, very difficult relations on this key issue between the European Union and Russia, because now energy security is deeply politicized, meaning that it has overtones of political and security threats attached to it, which makes it difficult to deal with neutrally, calmly, interdependently. There's a desperately asymmetrical sort of quintessential threat now attached to either side. There's a very us versus them paradigm attached to it, if I can put it this sense. It's not just simply two aspects of a different equation, security of supply and security of demand. It is very much a we, us, our geopolitical interests, and you and yours. And they're not lined up horizontally. There's no understanding that they can be interdependent or fungible. They're lined up vertically. It's us better on top and you underneath. So there's a fairly rank hierarchy going on there. And it's beginning to have a very corrosive effect in terms of policy making. And what is missing, therefore, is really just to get back to the original definition. How do you equitably get what people need, provide available, affordable, efficient, reliable, and of course, climate change friendly, or as I have it here, environmentally benign, properly governed, socially acceptable energy services? That's what's missing. Both sides understand this, but I think what is missing is the not just political will. We say this all too easily. Language, a common language, an ability to understand and to understand the different conceptions and perceptions, if I can put it this way, of what the other side says and wants. And I think one thing that continues to worry the European Union, not just in terms of language, but of course the building, the perennial Russian pipe building, the ambitions, which they see continuing. Here's a nice little slide of the pipelines going up. The EU's main gas and oil supplier obviously continues to be Russia. And clearly Russia has set itself out to be the main export route. It wants to dominate in a very pan-continental fashion for energy producers in Central Asia and Northern and Central Europe as well. And it also wants to be a prime supplier, and it clearly can be for future customers in Asia if pipeline building can go that way, as well as being a very successful new investor in Africa. It does not want to be a political customer of the European Union. It wants to be the strategic partner, and probably one better than that as well. I wish I could say that I had coined this term, but it's coined by a friend of mine at Cambridge, promiscuous bilateralism. So if you continue to get a sharpness of words and an accelerated politicization, the outcome really is sort of a tit for tat. That realists, realpolitik observers would know and feel right at home with. And I think this is perhaps best encapsulated in the building of the Nord Stream pipeline, which opened in 2011. The first of the twin pipelines started pumping gas from Nord Stream from Russia into the European gas grid. Now have a look at the 5 shareholders of Nord Stream. Gazprom, of course, the chief shareholder, but also European ones as well. So in a sense, although it clearly was built in order to avoid transit difficulties aimed squarely at Ukraine and Poland, it is to some extent a rather nice partnership, depending on who holds the majority of the shares, of course, between Russia on one side and the European Union on the other, or these private European companies, if I can be a little more clear. Then again, some of these, of course, have large state holdings as well. So there's a very blurry line between the public and private partnerships in this sense. But I think you could say, and this may be a little idealistic, that there's a degree of co-ownership going on, and a degree is a very good place to start at any rate. That could work, but the risk, if it doesn't, of course, is a regionally zero-sum output, in which, again, you have this kind of tit-for-tat, which can take the form of gas pumps as well. Here's a little quote from Putin, I think, that tries to encapsulate the idea of pipe building as part and parcel of Russian foreign energy policy. He says, "We consider it our common objective to upgrade and diversify our energy infrastructure." This is what is the main role of a major hyper supplier like Russia. "You know that we have completed the Nord Stream gas pipeline system under the Baltic Sea," he says. "We have launched another pipeline project that will run under the Black Sea, the South Stream. All this, along with the use of Ukraine's gas transportation system and expansion of the Yamal Europe gas pipeline, will continually increase energy security on the European continent." So it is a Russian project, but of course what it will guarantee and significantly underwrite is energy security for Europe as well. That's certainly the easy perspective. And again, Medvedev, the Director General of Gazprom, making that very clearly. Putin, Gazprom, and Russia have only one topic, and it's a continuing topic: to sell as much gas as our neighbors need. They need it, we have it, we're going to sell it. there is, after all, only a limited number of countries producing gas. So, if the politics don't work, at least the numbers do. A variety of pipelines I think you should be aware of. There's dozens and dozens. I certainly wouldn't expect you to know them all. But the Northern Lights, the Soyuz and the Brotherhood, the first transit in Belarus, roughly 20% of all gas to the European Union, and the Soyuz and the Brotherhood into the Ukraine, somewhere between 70 and 80%, and then beyond that, coming out of Poland, the ML Europe and Druzhba. And of course, Russia's particular options that it has with regards to its anti-transit, either to invoke more gas spats, which are difficult and don't have very good outcomes, of course, but to look at new partners to foster new routes, however long it takes. A few slides, therefore, just to show you. Here's Nord Stream and South Stream. You can look at these at your leisure with a cup of coffee. Blue Stream pipeline from Russia to Turkey. And the response, I think, of the European Union, of course, is to either, deal with this politicized framework and try to find a post-partnership cooperation agreement with Russia that accurately and viably deals with energy security, or keep it outside the main topics of EU-Russia agreements and continue to keep it in a small kind of little dialogue like the EU-Russia dialogue, where it's never fully dealt with, not accurately, and to continue finding or at least even anti-Russian methods of drawing on Caspian gas and oil from Baku, for example, without transiting Russia. And the two corridors on option, the transatlantic pipeline and the Nabucco West pipeline. So here's a picture of Nabucco, just so you can get a sense of how you would have to skirt round through Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary to come up to the gas hub in Vienna, or alternatively to run down across through Greece and Albania if you wanted to do the Black Sea route up into Italy. Both very, very viable methods, I think, but far from being anything close to a pipeline, much more like a pipe dream. And it's in no way a done deal, as I've suggested here in this slide, because Gazprom tends to own a lot of the shares even of these deals. So the very final point that I'd suggest, of course, is it's not so much even a matter of accurately finding a way for EU and Russia to talk about energy security. I think even before that has to happen, energy security as a term has to be looked at, and the sting must be drawn from it so that it can become, I think, again, a kind of a neutral term, a depoliticized term. Some of the readings that I've done suggest that perhaps it's a little too simple just to say it's security of supply and security of demand. This rather fuller definition, even with a kind of a social component, perhaps, is a rather better understanding, a better description of the enormously huge impact that energy has on contemporary states and modern regions like the European Union. And there's virtually nothing we do in our day-to-day life, minute to minute, that is not somehow driven or affected by energy. So if we think of it in terms of a sort of a five-part dimension, if you like, of availability and affordability, reliant on ongoing cutting-edge technology development, well-regulated and ultimately sustainable, then I think if all these points act as touchstones to some degree, you're going to be looking at a way in which both sides clearly have a point of recognition on each of these and can contribute their understanding into the components that I have here on the right-hand side. And surely there you could begin to iron out some of the asymmetries. There's clearly always going to be a buyer and a supplier, but you can make it fungible, you can make it integrative, if you like, you can make it sound. And you can make it predictable, and I think that's really at this point what's been missing. So that brings me to the end of that presentation. I think I'm just going to ask Silvio, who has been monitoring this from the beginning, and my thanks to him, just to pop up a final slide so that I can remind you of the upcoming roundtables that we're going to be having. The next one, as you can see, is going to be on the 13th of June. Thank you, Silvio. Very quick and neatly done. On Europe and Central Asia, we finished one yesterday. We did the North Africa and Middle East, and that went very, very well, and that'll be available on the web probably in the next couple of hours. So the upcoming one in June will probably feature a little bit of Russia, and I may do a presentation on that myself. After that, and I hope we can include some of our IES colleagues as well, looking at Asia Pacific the pivot Pacific. And then finally, finishing up, and who knows whether the free trade deal may finally be signed between the European Union and America by then or not. I suspect not, on the 27th of June. So we're about halfway through, and these, I think, are, particularly for the Euromaster students, absolutely invaluable learning tools, pre-exam tools as well, at least with regards to the date, those that apply, because they encapsulate, again, you know, in sort of 30 or 45 minutes, some of the major touch points that we've been looking at all year long in Quo Vadis. So I think of them, I think, as a nice benefit to the Quo Vadis module, to the Jean Monnet webinars that we've had. So my thanks very much indeed for everybody who has been tuning in, to the attendees present. And of course, to those of you watching now in a recorded fashion after the event, and also very much this morning for Joachim and for Luis as well, for their excellent and incredibly detailed presentations. It's great to have very complex slides, actually, I think, because you have the time to look at them. You can always kind of go back and review them and listen again and again to what we've said. So thank you very much for tuning in, and you're certainly going to be hearing more from us with regards to these next roundtables on Europe and Central Asia, with a bit of Russia, Asia Pacific, and the Americas. So that brings it to a close for me, and we'll be touching base very soon. Thank you.